Okay, I think we're live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Marieke Huisman, and it's my pleasure to see you all joining for this first colloquium to celebrate the achievements of 25 years of IPN. This whole year until the next ICT Open, we plan to organize several events and activities to mark this anniversary. In particular, our plan is to organize a colloquium like we have today every month, except for the summer break until the next ICT Open. Before we start, one practical thing. If you have any questions, then please raise your hand and then we will give you the right to speak, to ask your question by voice. So that will be easier. Moshe just said it would be okay to take short questions during the talk. If you would like to discuss something more in depth, then rather do it after the presentation. And then, so let me introduce Moshe Vardi. Moshe is university professor and a Karen Ostrom George Distinguished Service Professor in Computational Engineering at Rice University. His research interests focus on automated reasoning, branches of artificial intelligence with broad applications such as machine learning, database theory, computational complexity theory, knowledge in multi-agent systems, and computer-aided verification. He has received numerous awards and other honors for his achievements. The most recent one is the 2025 IEEE CS Computer Pioneer Award in honor of the women of ENIAC, but there are many more awards, fellowships, etc., including 7 honorary doctorates. If I would list them all, I would use the whole hour, I fear. He served also for a decade as an editor-in-chief of the communications of the ACM and is currently a senior editor for this journal. He's also a dream of every session chair. I remember him attending a conference, always sitting in the first row and asking very well-informed, to-the-point questions after every presentation. Today, Moshe will talk about efficiency, resilience, and artificial intelligence, and I'm very much looking forward to what you have to tell us about this topic. So, Moshe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me as the first colloquium. And I just learned a little more about the IPN. I wish you all the best. So I want to talk about this topic, about efficiency and resilience, and then towards then I'll come back to artificial intelligence. And I want to put it forward that this is a topic of the utmost, this trade-off that I'll discuss is the topic of utmost interest to us as both as computer professional, but also as citizens. And for me, once my eye opened to this particular way of looking at the world, once I see something, I cannot unsee it. I think it's really of the utmost importance. So let me start by describing some recent adverse events. I'll go back to 2021 first. During February, a week where there was a what we call polar vortex, a block of Arctic air swept down all the way from Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico in Houston because of the cold weather. We lost power for about a week, and without power, eventually we lost flowing water. And it was the costliest US natural disaster. The estimate cost damage was $300 billion and over 700 fatalities. So major event. And another disaster happened a few years earlier in 2018-19. 2 Boeing 37 MAX planes crashed, killing almost 350 people. In each case, it was a failure of something called MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristic Augmentation System. I'll talk about it more a bit later. And the cartoon here shows Boeing, the company with its wings bent. In fact, Boeing never recovered really from the reputational damage of these 2 crashes. And the event that really has shaped a generation, and I think we're all suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome after this, is COVID. It started as a public health crisis, and you may remember the dashboard where we look at to see how many people are in the hospital, how many people have died, and the like. but it was, in addition, on top of it, it was also an economic crisis because many businesses had to close. Many people lost their jobs. So here is an article from November of 2020, just before Thanksgiving holiday in America, which is a big family holiday. And what you see here is not the parking lot in Disneyland. These are people waiting in line in their cars to get food from a food bank because over 25 million people simply did not have enough food to put on the table. And it also became a social crisis. You know, we have the Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations and the protests and the riots. And again, it's hard to imagine this would have happened without the sensitivities that was due to COVID. And it ended up being a political crisis. Here you see the January 6th crashing into Congress to stop the certification of the 2020 presidential election. And one question one would ask when you see such crisis, especially about COVID, let's start with COVID, is why were we not ready for COVID? So here is a cover of a book, The Viral Storm, The Dawn of a New Pandemic Age by Nathan Wolfe. And from the cover, if you had to guess, you say, oh, this must be a book about the COVID pandemic. Except that this book was published in 2011. It was predicting a pandemic, yet we were not ready. 2006, during the George W. Bush administration, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is testifying to a special Senate committee preparing for the pandemic flu. And yet we are not ready. 2009, President Obama is meeting with science advisors to talk about precaution for a possible swine flu. And yet we are not ready. 2019, there was an exercise during, this is just before the pandemic exploded, right? We have an exercise looking at the coordination between the federal government, the state, local governments about a flu pandemic originating from China. That was the exercise. The key finding was, excuse me, the federal government does not have enough funding to respond to a severe influenza pandemic. And yet we are not ready. So let's go back to the early days of the pandemic to kind of figure out what really happened. So in March 2020, just as the pandemic was exploding upon us, a phrase became popular, which was called flattening the curve. And the argument was that all pandemic proceeds in a bell-shaped fashion. Many people get infected, but eventually the pandemic slows down because people die or get immunity. And then pandemic subsides eventually on its own. The only question is how many people are sick and die. And the argument was that we have to flatten the curve. We have to not reduce the number of people, but have a flatter curve of the spread of the pandemic. And the argument was that the healthcare system cannot cope with very high number all at the same time. In fact, if you may remember, in March 2020, there was places, for example, New York City, Brooklyn, or northern Italy, where the healthcare system simply crumbled under the onslaught of cases. So argument was many hundreds of thousands of infections will happen. Of course, this was widely optimistic. We had many millions of cases, but they don't all have to happen at the same time. And here is an article from Market Watch in April 2020. Nurses are wearing garbage bag as they battle coronavirus, which is something out of Twilight Zone. So why were they wearing garbage bags? Because they were trying to protect themselves. And the hospital did not have enough PPEs, personal protective equipments. So hospitals were not ready for a pandemic. So even though we had all the warnings, the pandemic is coming, we were not ready. And that inspired an economist, William Galston, to write a column in March 2020, late March 2020, in the Wall Street Journal. Efficiency isn't the only economic virtue. In which he asked, what if the relentless pursuit of efficiency, which has dominated American business thinking for decades, has made the global economic system more vulnerable to shock? And he explained efficiency comes through optimal adaptation to an existing environment, while resilience, dictionary definition, is the ability to recover readily from illness, depression, adversity, or the like, while resilience requires the capacity to adapt to disruptive changes in the environment. So efficiency is about optimal adaptation, and resilience is about adaptability, two different things. And that article really opened my eyes. So to look at this tension between efficiency and resilience, let's look at just-in-time manufacturing. So just-in-time manufacturing became popular in the 1980s in the business community in the United States, because people suddenly realized that the standard way of managing manufacturing was very inefficient. What was the standard way? You have a warehouse. Parts are stored at the warehouse, and then they are taken from the warehouse to the manufacturing line, to the production line. But that means you have to build a warehouse, you have to put things in the warehouse, you have to take stuff out of the warehouse. While parts are in the warehouse, they're not earning any money. So why not eliminate the warehouse and let the parts arrive at the manufacturing line, at the production line, just in time? So just in time indeed is very efficient. You eliminate lots of unnecessary cost, but you assume best case logistics. The parts have to arrive at the production line just in time. So you have no resilience. And indeed, COVID gave us a demonstration of this. The picture here is a picture I've taken at Costco, which is a very large, it's a supermarket, but very, very large supermarket. This is the paper products section. And you see one thing that's missing here almost is paper products. So there was an article in August of 2020 in the Wall Street Journal. Why are there still not enough paper towels? And they say blame lean manufacturing. Lean manufacturing is another term for just-in-time manufacturing. A decades-long effort to eke out more profit by keeping inventory low left many manufacturers unprepared when COVID-19 struck, and production is unlikely to ramp up significantly anytime soon. In fact, the inflation that we had, post-COVID inflation, the COVID inflation, was the result, on one hand, of supply shortages and the fact that central banks reduced interest rate, essentially flooded the market with money, but there are not enough products. So we had inflation. And in fact, to talk about the supply chain crisis, we have to remember what happened in the Suez Canal. First of all, container boats have become very, very large. Why container boats have become very large? Because it's more efficient. And then one pilot made an error in the Suez Canal and steered the boat towards the edge of the canal and got stuck there and blocked the canal. So one person's error disrupted the global supply chain for many, many months. One person's error disrupted the global supply chain for many, many months. So we had efficiency at the expense of resilience. And once you see it everywhere. Why did, again, Wall Street Journal from September 2020, why did COVID overwhelm hospital? A years-long drive for efficiency. Health system kept a tight rein on employee numbers and expanded outpatient care, helping their finances but making them less prepared for a medical crisis. In the early days of the pandemic, most of the death happened in nursing homes. I remember I was actually in early March of 2020. I was in Seattle in a committee meeting, and we kept hearing every 2 hours somebody else is dying in one particular nursing home in Redmond, Washington. Again, what happened? The industry could have done more to stop the virus. The way to do it is whenever somebody becomes sick, you isolate them, but that requires empty rooms, and it's not efficient to have empty rooms. So by the big hit in terms of COVID death was in long-term care facilities, nursing homes. Now let's go back to what happened in Texas. Why was Texas not ready for a wave of cold air? There were warnings that this can happen. And indeed, in February of 2023, just a week after the a few days after the loss of power, Morgan & Morgan, a large law firm, filed a class action lawsuit against ERCOT, EXO, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, alleging that the non-profit corporation utterly failed to plan for the cold weather despite multiple warnings. Why did they not prepare? Because it's expensive to prepare for cold weather. So they took their chance and they failed. And you see it now. You say you're going to see it everywhere. We can go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and you can ask, how did it happen that Wall Street, which is the place that specializes in what's called risk management, how come they fail to manage their own risk? And if you look more carefully, and people have looked at it, there was an article called The Formula That Killed Wall Street. There is a formula called value at risk. And we can spend an hour talking about this particular Gaussian copula function, but it measures value at risk. That is, you want to know with probability 99%, I would not lose more than $1 billion, and I think I can survive $1 billion loss. But this doesn't tell you what happened in the tail event, what people call the black swan event. In the tail event, suddenly you lost $10 million, and now you cannot survive it. And that's why Lehman Brothers had to go to bankruptcy over a weekend. So again, the formula functioned well during normal time. It was very efficient, but it don't give us resiliency. We almost had a worldwide economic depression. And even if you look, remember, we saw the picture of millions of people not having food on the table. Why is that? This was, again, the precarity of American society was well known. Here is from Atlantic Monthly in May 2016. If you ask people, you have the brakes of your car suddenly fail, and it costs $400 to fix it. Can you handle it? And almost 50% of Americans says, no, I don't have $400 spare. I'll have to go and beg for relatives to help me. If you make it instead transmission, instead of a brake job and transmission, which is $1,000, 2/3 of Americans cannot handle unexpected expense of $1,000. And you have to understand, in the United States, if you don't have a car, very high likelihood you cannot get to your job. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your job. You probably cannot keep payment on your housing. You're going to lose your housing. So people live on the edge here. And we're talking about a very, very large fraction of the population. Adam Serwer wrote in the Atlantic in June 2020 about he wrote, it didn't have to be like this. The desperation of US workers in the aftermath of the coronavirus was the product, he wrote, of a series of policy decisions and missed opportunities. We focused on efficiency, we neglected on societal resilience. So I'd like to take a digression here to see how nature handled this tension between resilience and efficiency. And I'll go back to an article that I published when I was editor-in-chief of CSCM. This was in November of 2016. And the article, I gave it the title. I was very proud of the title. I proposed the title, Sex as an Algorithm. It was really a very serious article. It looked at the theory of evolution under the lens of computation. And the article was by Adi Livnat and Christopher Papadimitriou. And I asked the following question. If you look at evolution, and we see two mechanisms, bacteria produce via cell splitting and just mutations. So essentially local search. While higher order animals usually have sexual reproduction, that correspond to genetic algorithm because you have crossbreeding of chromosomes. Now we have experience with both these algorithms, simulated annealing and genetic algorithm in computation. And we know the simulated annealing is a better search algorithm than genetic algorithm. Much better. So why does nature choose asexual reproduction as the almost exclusive reproduction mechanism in animals, especially in higher order animals? Why use the inefficient way to optimize for an environment, which is what evolution is about? So the answer that Livnat and Papadimitriou give is that we should not only we should consider not only efficiency, but there are other aspects. Sexual reproduction gives the species greater genetic diversity. And that means when the suddenly environment changes, some organism will not survive, but the species will survive. The species becomes more resilient because of genetic diversity. So the trade-off here is that sexual reproduction makes the species more resilient. In fact, we can look at the trade-off between efficient resilience as between short-term optimization and long-term optimization. Why does nature focus on long-term, prefer long-term? Well, survival of the species. I think Darwin had told us. It is not the strongest of the species that survive, not the most intelligent. We should remember that. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. So the dinosaurs, you see here, T-Rex was a very, ultimate hunting machine, but could not survive climate change because of the meteor that landed on Earth about 70 million years ago. So survival of the species means that we have to consider resilience, long-term optimization. And here is, to me, one photograph that makes this point very, very clearly. You see here two beams of wood, the cut to two beams of wood. At the bottom, you have natural pine. Natural pine grows slowly. So you see the rings are small. It takes many years to get to this size of beam. At the top, you have genetically modified pine. It grows much faster. So you have much thicker rings, and it takes a small number of years to reach the same size of beam. But in terms of strength, it's obvious that the one at the bottom is stronger because it has more rings. So if we want the tree to survive a storm, they should grow slowly and have lots of rings, as opposed to grow fast and then break when there is a storm. So you see here the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. Now let's switch a little bit to computer science. So let's go to the art of computer programming, which is the closest we have to foundational text in computer science. And in fact, Don Knuth even coined the phrase, the analysis of algorithm. So what is the analysis of algorithm? Here's the definition of Wikipedia. In computer science, the analysis of algorithm is the process of finding the computational complexity of algorithm, the amount of time, storage, or other resources needed to execute them. So it is all about efficiency. When we teach an algorithm course, there's no discussion of resilience. It's all about efficiency. So let's look at an example of efficiency versus resilience in algorithm. One of the most successful algorithms of all time was PageRank. PageRank was an algorithm that Google used to rank, you do a search, and then you want to rank the pages. So you need to decide on the ranking, and this is a pun, the rank of the page, but also Larry Page developed the algorithm. So the idea of PageRank was that if many websites point at a website, that means it is an important website. If many important websites point at one website, then this means it's a very important website. If many very important websites point to a website, it's a very, very important website, and so on and so forth. And now you go to the mathematical theory, and you get to eigenvalue and random walks. And this gives, you may remember the early days of search engine, you got lots of, you had to scroll through pages of results. Once Google came, usually the top link was what you wanted. But very quickly, a whole industry arose called search engine optimization. If I'm going to start, let's say, Israeli restaurant in Houston, and I want to fly to there are not many Italian restaurants, because there are not many Israeli restaurants in Houston. But let's say Italian restaurant, and I want to make sure it goes to the top of searches. I'll create many websites. They all point at each other, so they'll become very, very, very important, and they will all point at my Italian restaurant website. And my Italian restaurant website will flow to the top. So once the algorithm became known, it was clear that it's very easy to spoof it. It is not resilience. In effect, Google many years ago stopped using PageRank. The patent has expired, And if you look today, you ask Google, what is the algorithm today? They will not tell you. It's a trade secret now. Because if they tell you, then they are going to enable the search engine optimizers. So this is an example of efficient algorithm, which was completely not resilience. But let's look at another aspect, which usually doesn't quite come under computational complexity, and I call it friction. So already more than a decade ago, I wrote in communication of the ACM about friction. I wrote, our discipline is dedicated to reducing friction. Latency must be eliminated. Bandwidth must increase. Ubiquity should be universal. Our goal is to reduce the friction of computing and communication as much as possible. In fact, Facebook, what was the motto of Facebook? Mark Zuckerberg told us many years ago, the goal was frictionless sharing. Make sharing as easy as possible. Except we now know that easy sharing has all kinds of problems. Filter bubble, fake news, extreme content. I can give a whole talk just on what happened because it's just too easy to share on Facebook. Let's look at other manifestations of reducing friction. In 2010, in May 6 of 2010, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the US stock market crashed suddenly. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 600 points in 5 minutes, evaporating $1 trillion from global equity markets. $1 trillion evaporated in 5 minutes. What was the cause? There was an investigation, and the US Security and Exchange Commission identified high frequency trading as the cause of the crash. So today, most trading decisions are made by algorithms. And the traders want to be executed as fast as possible. So they have developed a whole technology how to cut down the delay between the decision and the execution into microseconds. So what happened? One algorithm makes a trading decision, execute it quickly, that immediately impact other algorithms. They also execute it very quickly. So in 5 minutes, suddenly everybody decide to sell, and the stock markets come crashing down. Now, what was the argument in favor of this high frequency trading? Well, the proponents said make the markets more liquid. But even the people who initiated it saying, well, at some point there is a point of diminishing return. Thomas Peterffy argued today's drive for speed has absolutely no social value. Economists who studied this a decade ago said the high frequency trading arm race is a symptom of flawed market design. They said that the SEC should have just imposed mandatory minimum delay to stop this cutting it down, spending tons of money and going from 1 microsecond to half microsecond. They said there's no economic value. And we can even take it to personal affairs. So today there is online dating, and some apps are trying to make dating as easy as possible. On Tinder, you swipe right if you like someone, you swipe left if you don't like someone. How much easier can it be? But in 2010, Jenna Birch wrote, why is it so hard to turn a date into a relationship? She said, I've had lots of dates, but I'm not turning into relationships. And studies have confirmed that if you meet online, you're less likely to form a lasting relationship. And what is the answer? The answer is because you're less invested. Your effort was lower, so you care less. There is an old country song, easy come, easy goes. No hard feeling, darlings, no regrets. If you're less invested, you're making less of an effort. So reducing friction in this case means people are less invested and relationships don't last. And let's take another example of the result of frictionless. Let's look at frictionless contracts. So we have two legal worlds. There's a normal legal world in which the laws are made by legislatures. And we all know that watching law made is like watching how sausage is being made. It's no fun to watch it, but at least we have public accountability. But when you come to our cyber life, all the laws are hidden in terms of services, in licenses, and we sign them a click through. And if you read them, you'll see they're completely one-sided. They're all written by big tech lawyers, for example. There's no liability because you have waived your liability when you click through. And part of the many of the social ills that we see today in our cyber life comes because the industry has no accountability. And why is it? Because it's very easy for us to click through contracts. And I wrote, I don't know what impact it will be, but the only way to improve, I think, our cyber life is to bust the shadow legal system over technology, which would just nullify all click-through contracts. Or to paraphrase Kate Crawford, we keep talking about AI and responsible AI. We need to talk about corporate power. And one way the corporate have power, because we click through these contracts. So at Rice, we have an engineering quad, and in one corner we have computer science, in the other corner we have mechanical engineering. Imagine I go to the mechanical engineer and tell him, computer science, we think that all friction is bad. We try to eliminate all frictions. You guys should do the same. They'll say, you're out of your mind. Friction depends where. Between the tire and the road, I want high friction. In the drive shaft, I want little friction. It has to be the right amount in the right place at the right time. You can't say that friction is good or bad. It depends where. We don't have such sensibility in computer science. We are so obsessed with efficiency that we try to remove all friction, and we must welcome it back. And let's go back to the 737 MAX. So what really happened there? So Boeing decided to design new jet engine, that will be more fuel efficient. Now, normally when you design a new engine, you have to design a new airframe. So the airframe and the engine have to match each other. But it was expensive to design a new airframe. So Boeing said, let's use an old one. That's why it's called 737. It's to use the airframe of the 737 with the MAX are the new engines. But this combination was unstable. So Boeing said, no problem. We'll design a control system that will stabilize the plane. Well, the control system has to measure what is happening. So it needs sensors. Let's save money. Let's base it all on one sensor. And so what happened is, if this one sensor failed, the MCAS could not stabilize the plane anymore, and we have two horrific crashes. And as I said, Boeing has never recovered from that. And so again, it was obsession with fuel efficiency and time to market at the expense of safety. David Gelles wrote in the New York Times in November 2020, the Boeing 777 MAX is a saga of capitalism gone awry. And again, it's the obsession with efficiency. Let's talk a little bit about computer security. So some years ago, I wrote something bemoaning the lack of a sense of crisis in our community. We just behave as things are normal and are not. And I got an email from a colleague of mine who wrote to me, you don't understand security at all. And he explained how it works. First, somebody built a thing. This is very colloquial. I'm quoting his email verbatim. I just want to mention his name. Somebody builds a thing, it's super useful. Then eventually someone comes along and finds a vulnerability. Then security becomes part of the engineering process. Just as we like to make sure that our code does not have bugs to make it crash, we also need to make sure that our code does not have bugs that can make it be stored for bad purposes. Turn the crank for enough years, and eventually security gets better. So what is it telling us? Security is at the bottom of the priorities. And in fact, surveys have confirmed that. A survey of nearly 1,200 free and open source software contributors found security to be low on the developer list of priorities. So we focus on functionality, security at the end. Why? Again, we're obsessed with efficiency. So here we are, more than 75 years into the computer age. We can look at the Turing Award to give us the milestone of the high accomplishment in computer science. And there are 4 Turing Awards in cryptography, but none in cybersecurity. And I once talked to people on the Turing Award committee. I said, how come there's nothing in cybersecurity? And they told me, name a contribution. And I couldn't come up with one other than cryptography. Cryptography is part of security, but only a small part. And now we have vulnerability. It's not just that somebody will steal our credit card. We have vital infrastructure that can be paralyzed. Major pipeline in 2020 was forced to close by cyber attack. A pharmacy chain has been forced to close because of ransomware attacks. And yet our community does not have a sense that this is a crisis. I think this is a crisis, but this is my own personal opinion. I don't see, you go to a security conference and it's business as usual. And one reason for that, I claim, is an attitude of our community, which I would call cyber libertarianism. Let's compare computing to another important technology, automobile technology. So the Ford Model T, which was the first mass-produced, mass-consumed automobile, rolled off the manufacturing line around 1910. And pretty soon people discover automobiles are very convenient, they're very efficient, but people get killed. So within 15 years, just over 15 years later, we established a National Transportation Safety Board. And we don't have anything like that for security. And we have been able to reduce automobile fatalities by a factor of about 1,000. How? Using regulation. But in tech, we don't like regulation. The cyber libertarian says, no, regulation will stifle innovation. But it's very clear that situation will not improve when it comes to cybersecurity if you leave things to the industry, because they have no liability, because we all have granted them waiver of liability. The only way we'll get better security is if we have regulation. And this is a slide I borrowed from a colleague of mine. So first, on the left, you see that within a few years, people made an amazing innovation. You put a white line in the middle of the road to tell car which side to drive on. Of course, today we think it's obvious. It was not obvious at the beginning. And it had to be accepted that roads must have a white line in the middle. On the right, you see my colleague from Iceland. He had a major accident and he came out fine. The car was totally destroyed. He came out fine. And he said, how did he come out okay? He had a seatbelt. Seatbelts are required by regulation. Yet the car had an airbag required by regulation. The front end was absorbed the shock, required by regulation. So he came out fine, the car was destroyed. He said, my life was saved because cars are regulated. Now, remember, we started the talk by talking about economic efficiency. So let's go back to efficiency. So it's very clear why we did not get ready for the pandemic, because it's not efficient. It costs money to get ready for a pandemic, and maybe the pandemic will not happen. In February of 2020, just 2 weeks before the pandemic blows up on us, when it's becoming clear that something is happening, President Trump, this was in Trump's first administration, defend huge cut to the CDC budget by saying we can hire more doctors when we need them. Of course, when you need them, it's too late to go and hire them. In fact, amazingly, the Trump administration shut down the CDC Vaccine Safety Office in 2019. Who needs it? So let's dig a little bit into economics. What is economic efficiency? So I went to Investopedia, and they define economic efficiency to mean that goods and factor of production are distributed or allocated to their most viable uses and waste is minimized. Furthermore, free market advocates argue that through individual self-interest and freedom of production as well as consumption, economic efficiency is achieved and the best interests of society as a whole are fulfilled. So the free market does everything. It does both efficiency and it promotes overall economic prosperity. Even some economists are skeptical. Danny Roderick wrote, economists tend to be enamored with the power of markets to promote overall economic prosperity. Roderick is skeptical, but he said economists in general believe the free market is a panacea. So I want to examine this question. Does efficiency guarantee optimality? Amazingly, this question was not asked by economists for many, many years. So in 2008 was a financial crisis, and we almost went into a deep depression. And I was very shaken. So I decided I have to teach myself a little bit of economics. And you discover very quickly is the most fundamental theorem of macroeconomic is called the first welfare theorem. What it says is under certain technical assumption, free market will converge towards a competitive Pareto optimal equilibrium. And that's Pareto optimal equilibrium, that's the definition of efficiency. Nobody can gain unless somebody else loses. That's by this is the definition of economic efficiency. Okay, so free market gives us efficiency. But does it guarantee that this serves the best interests of society? And this question was asked by computer scientists. Remember Papadimitriou, he likes to look at the computational lens. And in 1999, together with Kotsopias, they decided to look at the game theoretic equilibria. They look at Nash equilibria, but the same thing can be shown for Pareto optimal equilibria. And they said there are many equilibria. We don't know which one the system will converge to. Some will be better in terms of total societal utilities than others. So they use tools from comparing approximation algorithms. So they look at the best equilibrium versus the worst equilibrium. And this has become known as the price of anarchy. And it turns out that this can be, there could be exponential gap between them, depending on the number of agents in the system. So economic efficiency does not guarantee that the best interests of society as a whole are fulfilled. This is a myth, it's ideology. Okay, the free market does many things, but it does not guarantee societal optimum. In fact, in a paper a few years later, Papadimitriou together with Daskalakis and Goldberg showed another important result. They said, how do we find Nash equilibria? Well, the way we find Nash equilibria, how does the system converge? Well, somebody decides to raise the price, somebody else decides to buy less, somebody else decides to produce less. So it's a sequence of local steps. So the way the market converges to an equilibrium is via local search. Well, what they were able to show is that finding Nash equilibria is p-pad complete, which means it's unlikely to be in polynomial time, most likely take exponential time. But if it takes exponential time for markets to converge to equilibrium, it means they will never converge. Because circumstances will change, something will happen. There will be bad weather, other events. So markets actually never converge. Equilibrium is a mythical beast, it's like a unicorn. It does not really exist, it's a theoretical construct. So in reality, we have no efficiency and no optimality. In fact, some of the very foundational economic ideas, and I'm not trying to justify Donald Trump tariff wars right now, but if you go back all the way back to the whole idea of free trade, it goes back to David Ricardo in the early 19th century. And the argument was, yes, if one country is better at making wool, another country is better at making cotton, they should each focus on their core competency and trade. And that will be more efficient. And this is true, it's more efficient. But is it resilient? So Europe still relies on natural gas from Russia. Bloomberg wrote about it. Europe sleepwalked into energy crisis that could last years. Look at the supply chain for semiconductors. We have the majority of the capacity is in Taiwan, which is the most geopolitical tense place in the world. So free trade is efficient, but it's not resilient. But still people believe in the invisible hand. Here there was a movie, famous movie, Wall Street, from 1987. And then Michael Douglas is playing Gordon Gekko, a businessman, and he gives a speech. Greed, for lack of better word, is good. Greed is good. Why? Because of the invisible hand. So somehow the invisible hand tells us that everybody could be greedy and somehow we will get social optimum. But we know in computer science that this is not the case. That greedy algorithm gets stuck in local optima. And you need a systemic intervention to drive them out of such optima. In fact, the whole idea of simulated annealing is to do local search, but once in a while do systemic intervention to get out of local optima. So right now in terms of cybersecurity, we are stuck in a local optimum, or local minimum, which is very bad, and it's market failure. There is no incentive for company to invest more in cybersecurity, and the only way we'll get out of it is by systemic intervention, means regulation. And even some business people, Mark Benioff, who is the CEO of Salesforce, wrote a public article in 2020. Greed is good, except when it is bad. And he said, I did not agree with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was the advocate of laissez-faire. I did not agree with him then, and the decade since I've only exposed his myopia. Just look where the obsession with maximizing profit for shareholders brought us. Terrible economic, racial, and health inequalities, the catastrophe of climate change. It is no wonder that so many young people today now believe that capitalism cannot deliver the equal, inclusive, sustainable future they want. This obsession with efficiency has had horrible consequences. So look where we are today. We have wealth polarization in the United States. Today, the top 1% have more wealth than the middle class. The middle class is everybody between the 20th and the 80th percentile. And the top 1% has more wealth than the middle class. So 1% of the people has more wealth than 60% of the people. But let's go back to COVID, because certain things in COVID did work. So I would argue that mRNA vaccine saved us, but also the internet saved us. Because I still have an email from March 12 of 2020, where I write to my research group. I said, from now on, everything is virtual. And look at us now. I'm giving now a talk. I get up in the morning and I give a talk in the Netherlands. Okay. So suddenly over a week, but this happened very, very quickly. In a few days, we went working from home, shopping from home, teaching from home, learning from home, seeing doctors from home. How was it possible? How was Zoom, a company that nobody heard of, in the first week of 2020, suddenly be able to provide such services in the second week of 2020? Were they able to scale up enormously because there was capacity in Amazon Web Services because of redundancy. So redundancy is a key design principle to give you resilience. And we've known it for years. Error correcting codes are all about redundancy. Von Neumann wrote an article in 1956. He said cells are not reliable, but organisms generally are. Why is that? Because we have redundancy of cells. After the crisis of 2008, what is the solution? Redundancy of capital. And in fact, I find it just deep historical irony by the fact that we survived COVID. You know, if we didn't have Zoom, we would have to continue to go to work. We would have survived COVID, but with a order of magnitude more death. I mean, there's no question about it. How did we get such a resilient communication system? It goes back to the 1960s. There was a Cold War. You have two nuclear powers facing each other. It was very important for each side to have second strike capability, because otherwise each side has incentive to strike first. For example, United States, we have what's called a nuclear triad, which is submarines and ICBMs and strategic bombers to give us resilience. But it's not enough. You have to have communication resilience, so the president can make the order if it has to. And it turned out that the phone system, which is based on circuit switching, can be easily disconnected by choice by attacking some key points. So instead we develop packet switching, which give us a much more resilient communication system, because communication requests can always be rerouted. So you have redundancy of path. And that's what ultimately gave us the internet. And that's ultimately how we're able to survive COVID. Now let's talk about AI. What is AI about? Here are some titles. AI is all about efficiency. MIT Sloan, October 2023. How generative AI can boost highly skilled workers' productivity. March 2024, AI is boosting workweek's efficiency. September 2024, AI is revolutionizing business efficiency. February 2025, AI lifts workforce to new height of efficiency. Tech Radar, all again, efficiency, 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 efficiency. But at the same time, you look at US society, and there is a trend that has been now going for decades. Now, when you read about unemployment, you see unemployment is not high. But unemployment means it doesn't mean what people think it means. Unemployment measures how many people that are looking for a job are not finding jobs. So there are two ways for unemployment to go down. One is more people finding jobs, or more people stopping to look for jobs. So the economists want to better measure, they call it labor force participation. And that measure how many people are either working or looking for a job. And what you see here that we have had more complicated trend over the past, what is it now, 50 plus decades. So starting in the 60s, women joined the workforce. But if you focus on men, you see the level of participation has been declining now for 50 plus years. And when men are not working, this is very bad for society. In fact, we know that when women are not working, it's because they're usually not being paid, but they're working. They're taking care of someone very old or very young. When men are not working, they usually play video games. So it's very bad for society to have so many unemployed men or not working men. And this is what we have to worry about: efficiency. What will we do to employment? And we look why it happened. I mean, it's very clear. Here's a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Much of the decline is due to increased technology, automation, and import competition. Technology is efficiency. Automation is efficiency. Free trade is efficiency. So AI may increase efficiency, but what it will do to societal resilience? And in fact, now it's not even, we don't have to worry only about factory workers. Where people are asking now the question, will AI replace programmers? And we're already seeing demands for software developers have been coming down for the past couple of years. So let me start to wrap up. Resilience, I would argue, is a fundamental but underappreciated societal need. And both computing and economics needs to increase the focus on resilience. And this is a challenge because markets and people are very bad at looking for very low probability event or very low long-term events. For example, in Texas, I have to renew my car registration every year. And when I do that, I have to prove to the state of Texas that I have car insurance. So even though I buy insurance to give resilience to myself, the state does not trust me to do it. It says, you are forced by law to do it. You cannot drive a car unless you have car insurance. So societal action is required to enforce individuals to become more resilient. And we have seen what happened when we have a crisis and we're not ready, the COVID crisis. And people have asked, what happened? Adam Tooze wrote in New York Times, what if the coronavirus crisis is just a trial run? And what is the biggest crisis coming upon us? It's climate change. In the summer of 2021, there was a heat wave in British Columbia. Now, British Columbia is considered to be the best climate on the American continent in terms of mildness, not too cold in the winter, not too hot in the summer. They had a historical heat wave. In fact, even in Oregon, the heat wave was so severe, the hospitals were overwhelmed. They said it was worse than COVID. They had such huge number of people with heat stroke coming. Again, the healthcare system could not cope with such a large number. And we have a hard time dealing with it. And the question I've been asking myself from the very beginning of the pandemic is, will it change us? Who will we be once COVID is over? Farid Zakaria wrote in October 2020, the pandemic upended the present, but it's given us a chance to remake the future. Will we take that chance? I'm not sure. Matt Simon wrote in December 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought incalculable suffering and trauma, but it also offers ways for people, even society, to change for the better. Will we take advantage of that? Wired magazine, from the fallen Champlain Tower to climate change, humans have not yet learned to avoid catastrophes that know are coming. We are so obsessed with efficiency, we are not able to build resilience. And this cartoon, to me, put it very, very nicely. It shows a political rally. And the politician asked the people, who wants change? And everybody raised their hand. Everybody wants change. Who wants to change? Nobody wants to change. Everybody wants change. No one is willing to change. That's our dilemma in one cartoon. And I have to quote Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote about climate change. We will go down in history, the first society that would not save itself because it was not cost effective. I finish by telling you a little anecdote. In the summer, a year ago in the summer, I gave this talk in the Salmon Institute at Berkeley. I gave the talk in the afternoon, and then after that, a bunch of us went to dinner. Then I came home. I came to my hotel room, and I opened my email, and I was flooded with email, because the next day, or started actually in the evening of July 18, a security company, CrowdStrike, pushed a faulty update. it brought down major global IT outages, banks, airline, business globally. I was not able to fly back. I was supposed to fly on Saturday back to Houston. I was not able to fly back to Houston. Big mess. And what did the Washington Post ask? What's to blame for cultural mess? Our drive for efficiency. New York Times asked, what happened to our digital resilience? And I got dozens of emails telling me, okay, you had to make a demo, but did you have to make it so bad after your talk? We got the point. You didn't have to make it so bad. And now what do we have? An executive order establishing and implementing the President Department of Government Efficiency. What will you do to our resilience? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's I can see a lot of hands. If people have questions, then please just raise your hand, and then we will give you try to give you the floor. So one thing I was wondering about is, so you said we need to have regulations, and it's the government that should do it, and but we also see that people in parliament and in the government, they often have no clue about things like security. So are they the right people to actually come up with these regulations, or who should do it?
So there was a structure in the United States, which is now being questioned. And the structure was that Congress would pass laws. You know, we have laws, and the law says that we're the Clean Air Act. The air has to be clean. Well, what does it mean for the air to be clean? That requires experts, right? Congress is not in position to do it. So you have, with the Congress established an agency, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and they are supposed to issue the precise rules, which Congress, if they want to, they can override. But we have created this. We created the principle, and then a government agency that's supposed to regulate it. Now, industry does not like regulation. So this structure have come under attack, and they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court recently reversed its opinion, and suddenly says, well, Congress cannot delegate. It's only Congress has the authority to regulate, and it cannot delegate authority to administrative agencies. Now, of course, this is Congress cannot operate fast enough and does not have the expertise to do it.
Yeah.
So this is really a way to strike against regulation, is to say, no, only Congress must do it, okay? And so this is the fight. I mean, the structure that was in place, which is Congress pass a law, establish agencies of experts, and experts debate it and do hearings, and they come up with the rules. That was the only rational way to do that, and that has come under attack because it's very clear industry hates regulation. So we will see where it ends up to, where this will end up. But it's not just about computing. It has to do with our clean air, with safety of food. People now forget the history of this. There was a book written in the 20th century, I think by Sinclair Lewis, if I remember right. It was called The Jungle. It described what was happening in meat packing plants. And people were shocked how unsanitary were the conditions where the meat that they're eating are produced. And that's what people say, we have to regulate it. We can't trust the companies to sacrifice profits for our safety. So they say, no, the government will step in to regulate safety. But this is an ongoing fight. And now with a conservative majority on the Supreme Court of the United States, we will see where it is going.
Yeah. Okay, and Jan Heemstra?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is mostly about like maybe a bit more into the specifics of how you would implement this regulation, because maybe I would ask you to comment on whether it's possible to implement this regulation in terms of what need of the result that you want to achieve versus regulating specifically what you would want to happen. For instance, with car regulations, it's mostly the latter, where you say the car must have seatbelts and it must have airbags, and it must have all of these things. Do you think that this could also be implemented in a way where you instead regulate what the result should be? For instance, with climate change, you could put a tax on CO2 emissions. And where do you think that could happen, and where do you think that these regulations would have to be more complex?
So nobody should say that right regulation is easy.
Yep.
Regulation is hard. Anybody has children is in the regulation business. You have to regulate your children.
Yep.
How to do it? Well, every parent knows that it's a dilemma. Okay. If you under-regulate children, they'll do crazy stuff. If you over-regulate, you have children that didn't learn to make decisions, take the responsibility. There is a phrase, American phrase, helicopter parenting. When the parents over-regulate and then the children come to college, they're on their own for the first time and they really cannot handle themselves, okay? They cannot cope with stuff. So finding the right balance is a challenge. But going back to car regulation, so you're right that seatbelt was a very specific thing. Thou shalt have a seatbelt or thou shalt have an airbag. But when it comes to absorbing front end, that's not the way it is done. So they do experiment, they put dummies in cars and they crash cars in a certain speed, and the dummy that simulates a human body, I'm not an expert on this, but the dummy, I've seen video, the dummy has to survive. They're not telling them how to do it. They're telling them, these are the results, okay? These are the results. The dummy should be able to survive without breaking, a crash, and into speed of 50 kilometers per hour or what have you. And it's their responsibility to engineer the cars to have absorbent front end. So there's an example where you specify the results rather than the outcome. Or when it comes to, like, for example, clean air, I mean, there are different approaches, but one is put emission limit.
So
it doesn't tell, but putting emission limit does not tell them how to do it. They have to figure out a way to minimize emission up to a certain level.
So I'm specifically interested in how you would do this with software security.
So, for example, one way to do it is to insist on not necessarily even outcome, but on process. So there was a lawsuit some years ago, I think it was against Toyota, because there was a phenomenon of sudden acceleration and people were injured or even killed because of that. There was a lawsuit. And the plaintiff won. And they were not able to show that there was specific, they were not able to show, here is the code that was running inside the car that caused the crash. Instead, they focus on the software reliability practices of Toyota. And they show that Toyota did not adhere to industrial standards of software reliability. That was enough for them to win. They were not able to show direct causality, but they showed you did not follow a standard procedure for reliability in this for safety critical system, therefore you are liable. Okay? And partly what happened with Boeing was the FAA used to certify new planes. And they would mostly focus again on the process. And then FAA told Boeing, you know what, you are a very experienced company, you know about airplanes better than us. Why don't you self-certify your airplanes? And inside Boeing, there was a change, and the CEOs became someone with an MBA rather than engineers. And suddenly it became about how can we save money. So the point is that I mean, look, I mean, I work in program verification. Is verification easy? No, verification is hard. Is there one way to do this? No, there is, again, how much effort do you put in? This is all about trade-offs. So you gave me an opening to talk about something that I don't have time in the talk, but I could give a whole talk on trade-offs. Because trade-off to me is again, a very, very important word that we don't talk enough about it. Because in real life, there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. That's not my sentence, it's an economist from Stanford that said it. And that's the only sentence he said that I agree with, but this one I agree with him, only trade-offs. And so, look, all of us, if you're a successful academic, what is your biggest challenge? Life-work balance. What's the way to do that? So economists would say easy. You reduce everything to utility, You figure out how much utility you get from work. You figure out how much utility you get from life, family life, let's say, and now you maximize the sum. But we all know it doesn't work that way because these are incomparable things. So we have to navigate a trade-off, and that's a difficult challenge. How do you teach your children about trade-offs? You give them an allowance. So you spend the money now, you don't have money later. That's a way, we don't realize it, but it's a way to teach them trade-offs. So doing the same thing, you can over-regulate, you can under-regulate, you know, there are schools of public policy. There are people who are experts in what is a good way to regulate, how much to regulate. There are all kind of other problems with regulation, okay? There's something called regulatory capture, which is very often to say the agencies need people with expertise. Where do you find them? In the industry. So do you end up with people going between industry and the regulator? So it's not an elegant, perfect solution. Poof, I substitute into the equation, everything falls out into place. But it's the way to deal with a major societal problem. And so far, it's the only way we know how to deal with it. And we debate, we debate about pollution. We debate to put explicit emission limit, to have carbon offsets, to have carbon tax. All of these people are debating, okay? And there's no perfect solution.
Thank you.
Okay. Moshe, maybe you can stop your screen sharing. And then I think there is another question by Olivier Spindler.
Yeah, we have a couple of more questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I stop now. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, first of all, so much for your talk, Moshe Vardi. It was really very inspirational. And I love as well your point of view about resiliency in our capitalistic system is that, for example, in Europe, we take what works from the US and we try to regulate it and try to put like this framework. And like you say, and then we get into this debate, is it under-regulated? Is it over-regulated? And I'd like to take this quote from I don't know if it was my school professor that actually said this, that capitalism is the best of the worst systems because, it works so far. And you talked as well about systemic intervention or even systemic rule changes and something in that direction. And I think something that really strikes me since I was little is that the KPI in our society is somewhat wrong. And for example, if you manage to find a business that pollutes as much as possible, it is in the end very cost efficient because actually the cost is being paid by nature. And this is something that always that there's nothing much we can do about it because, for example, even if you regulate it within Europe, then everything is going to go to China, for example, where it's deregulated, or in the US where it's more deregulated for more cost efficiency. And when you talk about Taiwan, for example, that's exactly why it happened in the first place because of regulation, because of unions, just everything got exported to abroad because it's more cost efficient. And is it resilient or not? When I remember when COVID showed the problem of the dependence on Taiwan for semiconductors, I was like, why is this happening? Why has this been the system that had been developed over years that we made such a central single failure point of being Taiwan, which is now the most geopolitical tense in the world for that reason as well. And so if to come back to efficiency, how can we make how can we make resiliency cost effective and capitalistic friendly through systemic interventions and rule changes? Would you have an idea how can we do that?
So economists. So I showed you that even perfect markets do not optimize for society. But on top of it, economists will tell you that what they call market failures. For example, they talk about market externality. So for example, because if pollution is free, then what are you going to do? You're going to pollute because pollution is free. And if it saves you money, if it costs you money to have less pollution, for example, one of the things that I have to do also in Texas, I have to take the car once a year to do an emission test, to tune the car to minimize emissions. And I'm forced to do it because if I didn't do it, why would I spend money to reduce pollution? Okay. So the state has to force me to do it. So one standard mechanism that we have in technology, in society to regulate people is liability. If you do something and people get injured, you are liable. And that's the way some people said, okay, how do I deal with it? One is you buy insurance, but you also behave in a more responsible way because you know you're liable. Now, what happened here, because we let these companies manipulate us by going through, oh, it's very convenient, just click through, okay? And when you buy I have this new Windows laptop, the terms The contract is 15,000 words. What's written in there? Okay. So we have let corporations basically do a run around the law, but basically you agreed, you sign a contract that says, okay, you're not liable. And so first we have to make them liable, and liability will give us, they will behave more responsibly if they are liable. Okay. I mean, the other thing to do is, if we decide one way to deal with it, we decide that certain products are risky, we can tax it. We can say, let's call it a risk tax. Okay. And taxation does two things. One is you can say taxation will reduce demand, but also we'll have money to deal with the consequences of the thing that we don't like. So there are ways, we have been kind of dealing with it. We have lots of technologies, and I would say is that every technology has benefits, costs and benefits, and we always try to do the trade-off between costs and benefits. Somehow we had the illusion in computing that we are all about benefit without costs. And this is just not the case. For example, we think ourselves as clean industry. Because software is very clean. But actually semiconductor production is not clean at all. They use all kind of horrible chemicals. And now Silicon Valley does not make silicon anymore. But they have discovered that companies were fabricating Silicon Valley, and they were just dumping the very toxic chemical into the ground, essentially polluting the aquifers there. And that was going on for years, and nobody knew about it. Okay. Now, of course, what happened? You're right. What happened in this world? You push them out. You say, no, we have regulation here. They go to other countries. Again, we can deal with it, but we have to have the spine to deal with it. We have lots of places where people go, countries that are tax shelters. Now we could stop it. We could basically say that if if Schlumberger, an oil service company, if you're incorporated in the Bahamas to avoid paying taxes, then we will tax you more here. Part of our problem is, are we willing to go and fight this? Look at the big tech today. These are all multi-trillion-dollar corporations. They have enormous political power. It's up to us to fight them. It's about, that's why I quoted before, it's about power, very much, not about the technology. It's about the people versus corporations. You can look at Adam Smith. What did Adam Smith say about corporations? When he would talk about the invisible hand, he was thinking about going to the small baker. He was not talking about dealing with a multi-trillion-dollar corporation. What does the US Constitution say about corporations? Nothing. Corporation barely existed. And so these are today, our economic life is mostly run by large corporations. And our funding document says nothing about it. We have nothing that would say, I think we need a constitutional amendment. We talk about the rights and responsibilities of corporations. It's a huge hole in our economic and political life.
Thank you. So maybe we should go to the next
yes,
person with the question.
Thank you.
Two more hands. So Stefano?
Yeah, thanks, Moshe, for the nice talk. I think efficiency had a big part in your talk, right? But I think you really nailed the head of the problem here when you mentioned two terms which came in the last slides, which were greed and profit, right? Because I think that the cause of the search for efficiency in a lot of cases, if not all of them, and this piggybacks off of Olivier's question, is the continuous look for profit, right? And then I can kind of see how can you make the argument of resilience versus efficiency, but when you sort of try to reach the root cause of the strive of efficiency, oftentimes you are met with sort of the look for profit, right? And that's what you also said when you were thinking about asking big companies to do the regulation, right? Or to self-regulate or self-test or self-approve the planes, right? But if a company is sort of end goal is profit, and when we saw, for example, OpenAI started as a non-profit, and then we saw where we landed with that. How can you make the argument of, okay, resiliency, but you shouldn't go for profit at all costs, right? Because I think that's a much more complicated argument than if you shift the focus on profit rather than efficiency.
I'm not telling the companies don't go for profit. That's why I'm saying we need, the way to do it is, for example, I'll give you one example. If you have progressive tax system. And we used to have in the United States, you know, the highest rate for taxation, I think, was like 90%. Okay. So in some sense, by having progressive taxation, you make it, you reduce the incentive. Okay, you accumulate the profits, but to get the, you know, if you make another dollar in profits, we'll take 90% of it. Okay. So reduce the incentive. So progressive taxation is one way to try to deal with this, try to maximize profits. Okay. Again, that's why I said I do not believe if you know, people talk about social responsibility of corporations. I mean, I think this is BS. Okay. The only way to deal with the greed motive is to laws and regulation. I don't know of any other way to do it. And taxes are kind of one way to do that. Liability, there are various ways of doing this. The economist John Keynes said something which I think to me is very wise. He said the problem with money is that it is abstract. So think of, do you remember Imelda Marcos, the wife of the Philippine president? She loved shoes. She accumulated shoes. So she had thousands of shoes at home in her palace, and everybody make fun of her because she had thousands of shoes. Who needs so many shoes? But money is abstract. So there is no limit of accumulation. Nobody gets embarrassed by having too much money, okay, as opposed to having too many shoes. So this is I mean, at the same time, the abstraction of money is an amazing societal invention. But the only way to deal with it is not by telling people don't be so greedy. That's not going to work, okay? Society needs to basically create rules and regulation, and believing that multi-trillion corporation will behave responsibly is just an illusion. They will not behave responsibly. Okay, we saw that. I mean, to me, what happened, in fact, not everybody knows I call it the winter drama of 2023. So ChatGPT came in November 2022. The following winter in 2023, Sam Altman is being fired from OpenAI, and then he gets rehired. So the story was that OpenAI started with people with good intentions. So they started a non-profit. Then they says, well, it's hard to raise money if you're a non-profit. So they created a for-profit subsidiary of the non-profit. And the idea was that the board of the non-profit will stay in control. And then they were able to raise money for the for-profit OpenAI. And then the non-profit board felt that Sam Altman was going too fast. It's too risky. And that's why they fired him. And then it became an epic battle between big money and big good intentions. Who do you think won?
I know who won, unfortunately.
We know who won. Okay. Partly because it's turned out there is a bound to how big your good intention can be. But billions of dollars kind of came there on the other side, and they had to bend down. Basically, Microsoft said that they're going to hire Sam Altman, and all the people from the for-profit OpenAI, everybody will go to Microsoft, and nobody will be left working for OpenAI, the non-profit. So they basically put a gun to their head, and so they bent. But so the idea was that they were able to control it by good intentions. Utter failure. It didn't work.
Thank you. So maybe we should move to maybe the final question of Peter van den Boos.
Peter, let me see your face.
Peter, are you there?
I haven't seen you for a while.
We're building up suspense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe he lost hope that he would ever become. Peter, are you there? You're muted. Maybe unmute yourself.
May I actually follow up maybe on what we were saying? Or maybe is Peter maybe here? Not? Because let's say in an ideal world, we managed to find the right regulation that the people's mentality, at least in the West.
So, sorry to interrupt you, but there is a question in the Q&A board. So I would like to ask that myself first, because you already had the chance to ask a question. So on the board it says, can resilience and efficiency coexist, and how? that was posted on the board. So maybe you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, of course, they coexist all the time. All of us make this kind of decisions all the time. So we, for example, you buy a car, okay? So some people want a safer car, so they buy a Volvo, and the Volvo is more expensive, and they says, okay, I'm willing to pay the money. I think it's worth it, and they're paying more. So it goes back to the trade-off. The only way I know how to navigate trade-offs is by a concept called satisficing. So Herb Simon, who is until recently, Jeff Hinton received the Nobel Prize. Before that, Herb Simon was the only person to receive both the Turing Award and a Nobel Prize. He was an economist and also did research in AI. And he said that classical economic theory assumed that people are optimizers. They always try, whatever utility, they try to maximize utility. And he said, in reality, people are satisficers. They want satisfactory solutions, satisfactory answers. They don't necessarily want to maximize, okay? So a way to deal with trade-off is to decide on the lower bound of what you want to achieve. So for example, when I buy insurance, I have to decide on the deductible. And I can say I want no deductible. That means whatever damage, I will get paid everything. I'm fully covered. But then my premiums are higher. Or I can decide I will take on my car insurance $5,000 deductible, and that would lower my insurance premium cost. So what am I doing when I do that? I decide how much resilience am I going to have and how much premium am I going to pay for it. So I decide, okay, $5,000, I can absorb $5,000, but on the other hand, if I have no deductible, then I have to pay more. So we make this trade-off all the time. Okay, insurance is a very clear case. You decide how much insurance you're going to buy. And that's a very clear trade-off between efficiency and resilience, because we know that insurance is very inefficient. I paid way more in premium than I have received in compensation with insurance company. We know insurance companies are good business. So that's an example. Buying insurance is a classical example. We each of us individually, we navigate. We have to decide how much insurance to buy.
Right.
And that's an example of the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. Peter.
Perfect. In the meantime, Peter has become online. So Peter, it's your turn.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay, but I'm used to Zoom, not to this program, Teams, and I never can find the buttons.
No worries.
Thank you. I think I've heard you previously. I've put the question also in the meantime in the Q&A. You are a computer engineer and you are talking to engineers, and engineers like to have things being measurable. So if you want to discuss efficiency, which we know very well how to measure it, I've been teaching that now for over 60 years almost, you also need to be capable to say something quantitatively about resiliency. And as far as I heard your presentation and the previous ones, it seems all to be qualitative. So should we start a program investigating quantitative measures for resiliency?
So you're right that we have spent way more time measuring efficiency as opposed to resilience. There are a few examples, even in computer science, think of what happened about Byzantine agreement. People talk about, failure. I mean, there are some cases, a fault-tolerant database where people have tried to do it. By and large, we have not done it. I mean, so partly my call is for us we need to start thinking about resilience in a scientific way. And there are already a few papers I've seen. Partly people told me we're inspired by your talk, and they go back and they start thinking to quantify resilience. There's one very beautiful example that was published actually a few years ago. I have the slides, but they had to stay on the floor, on the editing floor, so to speak, which is, imagine that you do sorting, but every comparison has a certain probability of giving you the wrong result, or maybe a random result, okay? And so David Ackley did simulations, and he said, let's take a list and let's run the algorithm, and then we can measure at the end how far it is from being so perfectly sorted by looking how many versions we have. So this all now it's very quantitative because you quantify a list, how well a list is sorted, you simply count inversions. And what he showed is the bubble sort was the best in terms of resilience compared to quick sort and merge sort, because it had redundant comparison and they turned out to cancel each other. But this was an example. That's a paper from the middle of about 10 years ago. I don't remember the precisely. I think it was in CSCM. And that was an example of trying to compare efficiency, where we measure how many comparisons we do, and then contrast it with resilience, which will be how many inversions we're going to have in the final result. So that's one paper where he really tried to put it together. There have been a few other awards I can send you privately. I will send you some link for some recent papers on resilience. People try to quantify this. But I think overall we have not done in computer science a good enough job of thinking scientifically about resilience. So that's why instead often it's more philosophical than quantitative.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So given the time, I would like to kind of wrap up the session. Moshe, I would like to really thank you for this wonderful talk. Very inspiring. So it was great to have you online over here. So thanks for that. So Marike had to leave. I'm afraid, so she cannot close the session anymore. So that's why I'm doing that right now. So again, thank you so much for being here. I think we enjoyed it absolutely. So thanks again, and I hope to see many of you, and maybe even you, Moshe, for the next edition of this IPN Colloquium series. So,
best of luck. I hope that I started something successful.
Absolutely, I think you did a wonderful job. So this was really great.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you next colloquium. So
bye-bye
everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.